Welcome back to another episode of Don't Waste the Chaos. I'm your host, Kerri Roberts, and today we're hopping into a topic that I think a lot of people they think they're good at, but it's one of the biggest leadership struggles that I see across organizations that I've been in, across organizations that are clients of mine, across personal relationships. We're talking about boundaries. And just like last week, gosh dang, this scheduling is tough. If you watched or listened to my episode last week, I had just gotten a little dental work done, and darned if I didn't get a little dental work done today too. So I had a little numbing going on. So this side of my face feels like I'm watching myself. I look normal, but man, I got a fat tongue. So bear with me if it sounds different at all. I've got crowns, you guys, not on my head, in my mouth. Okay. This is what we're jumping into. How boundaries are responsible. And I think most of us would say like, oh yeah, no, I've got good boundaries. And I learned over the past year in my personal life, I thought I had good boundaries. I'm not a people pleaser. And you know what? I learned otherwise in a few different circumstances. And so I jumped into the subject matter in a whole new way. And I would say professionally, I've always had really good boundaries. What I've learned is in my personal life, I've caved. And so jumped a little bit deeper. So today I'm going to be referencing a few different authors, speakers, people who have done excellent work and who have gone before us on these topics. Dr. Henry Cloud, Dr. Brené Brown, and I'm going to reference scripture and a few other things as well, Stephen and Mark Hovey. So let's get into it. There's a quiet anxiety that I hear from leaders when the term boundary comes up. They don't say it directly, but this is usually what it sounds like. If I'm too clear, then I'm coming across cold. Or if I hold the line on this, I'm going to lose their trust. Or if I assert my authority, I'm going to damage a relationship here. That's kind of the tone that I'm seeing with clients, or even when I'm talking to my girlfriends when it comes to their kids. So instead, leaders or we as individuals, we soften when it comes to our boundaries and our expectations and clarity. Usually what we do is we over-explain, or in the workplace, we'll write policies that we don't intend to even uphold. We immediately write the policy, but then we're like, we can think of a million exceptions that we're going to grant, or they just cave in real time, even when they know the decision is sound. And then they tell me that they have an HR problem, but most of the time they don't. I was just talking to a client about this the other day, a mortgage client, and they feel like they've got to clear some things up from an HR perspective, but they were also talking to me about X, Y, and Z. And while I was listening, I said, it's my personal opinion, and you can correct me here if I'm wrong, but you don't have an HR problem, but you do have a clarity problem. And clarity problem, boundaries problem, expectation problem, goal setting problem, communication problem. Listen, boundaries aren't harsh. They're responsible. And that's true in organizations, it's true in leadership, and it's true in our relationships. So why do boundaries get so misunderstood? There's this replaceability myth that I've read about. I've worked inside organizations with extremely tight work instructions. One of the organizations I worked at, they were a Malcolm Baldrige National Quality Award winner. We had work instructions and process summaries for everything. And what I saw in that organization was most people felt replaceable because everything was documented, everything was standardized. And so people felt like people were replaceable. That's not a boundary problem. That's an authority vacuum, because boundaries without presence of people can feel mechanical. And that's the struggle we had there. But presence without boundaries feels unsafe. And I think so many times we think about a safe work environment and we think of OSHA standards, or, if people feel comfortable to show up there. But if we don't have clear standards and clear boundaries, then most of the time, an employee can't maybe quite put their finger on it, but something feels off. Something feels like they can't bring their full self. Something feels like they can't fail. Something feels like they can't speak up when they disagree. So here's the leadership split. Here's the leadership tension, I guess I would say, that most executives don't name. They want boundaries to protect an organization, but they want flexibility to protect their identity as a good leader. That is right there in a nutshell what I see and what the tension is. They want these boundaries. They want this clarification. They want this policy. They want this black and white. They want this protection for the organization. But then they want to be able to give flexibility to protect their own identity as a good, caring, compassionate leader. So they split the difference. They write the firm policies, but then they undermine the policies in person over and over again. And that causes tons of trust issues, not to mention for middle managers or entry-level managers, it causes a ton of issues. It causes the perspective of favoritism and a number of other things. Therefore, it's not a safe work environment. I've watched leaders insist on precise language, clear expectations, and documented decisions only to completely collapse when the first manager or employee pushes back. Not because the policy was wrong, but because they didn't trust themselves enough to hold it. They didn't trust the relationship that they had with that employee or that manager enough to hold it. That's not kindness. That's fear, my friends. That's fear wearing empathy's clothes. We say we're doing it because we care about the employee, but we're really fearful that people don't respect us, that they don't trust our authority, that we're not being consistent. And it's really fear-based. So Brené Brown, in one of her books, differentiates vulnerability from boundarylessness, which many leaders confuse. And this is what she says. Vulnerability is telling the truth with discernment, knowing where you can tell the full truth. Boundary collapse is handing authority to other people's reactions. Leaders often think they're being vulnerable when they're actually seeking relief from the discomfort. So Brené Brown, when she's talking about it, she talks about how vulnerability without boundaries isn't brave. It's actually very unsafe. And in leadership, that shows up when leaders confuse transparency with over-accommodation of others. Saying, I hear you, does not require, and therefore I'll change my decision. Vulnerability without authority doesn't humanize leadership. It actually destabilizes it. When leaders soften boundaries just to be liked, they don't build trust. They actually outsource their authority to others. At a senior level, boundaries aren't about control. They're about containment. People don't feel safe because leaders are nice. They feel safe because leaders are consistent, reliable, predictable, and consistency requires authority. So let's talk about the cost of boundary collapse. Every time a leader caves, instead of explaining why a decision exists from the company perspective, these three things happen. And you're probably seeing this in your organization. The organization or the people inside of it learn that pressure works. You just apply a little pressure and they'll cave. Managers learn that escalation beats accountability. So we always talk about like the squeaky wheel gets the grease, same thing. You complain about it, you escalate your opinion, and you're going to get what you want versus being held accountable or holding yourself accountable. And then the leader also quietly loses credibility with others and with themselves. You've heard me talk about, you've listened to my show before, I talk a lot about self-trust. It's probably my favorite topic ever to talk about because we usually want to talk about, do I trust this person? Do I trust that person? But do you trust yourself? And as a leader, if you're acquiescing or going around policies every time you've got a little pressure, you don't trust yourself. And you might think, well, it's because I disagree with the policies. You're a crappy leader then, honestly. And I say that, and you might be like, okay, that's not true at all. If there is a policy that you utterly disagree with, you cannot get on board and you're having to circumvent it every single time consistently, that is a conversation that needs to be escalated amongst your executive team on why you cannot get behind that policy. And then you all need to hash that out. And if it is truly an alignment issue and you cannot align on the direction of the organization, you should not be there. Therefore, you're not the right leader for that organization. Or if it's a policy that like, it's fine, but you just see a million reasons to circumvent, why aren't you standing up for what the company believes? Why aren't you having those tough conversations with your peers? Policies or rules, the saying is they're made to be broken. There are exceptions to the rules. There always are. But the fact that you are just thinking that you're above the law a little bit is you might be creating some favoritism on your team, like people like working with you because you can get them what they want, but really there's no trust on your team. It's a bunch of cowboys. And I know that might be a hot take, but it's not the right thing to do to constantly be going around policy as a leader. If you truly cannot get on board, maybe you need to find an organization where you can. So Henry Cloud has some boundary principles that he has in a few of his different books. And one of his core boundary principles is simple but very powerful. Boundaries define who is responsible for what, and then also who is not responsible. From a leadership standpoint, boundaries are not about control. They're about ownership and they're about consequences. When leaders remove boundaries, they don't become more supportive. They actually become over responsible, and the organization then becomes underdeveloped. And this is something that I personally struggled with. I would say from a leadership perspective, this was one of my biggest flaws. And it's all kind of falls under this theme. One is I would see the potential of others, but really what I was seeing was my own potential in them, my capabilities in them. And I would want it more than they wanted it for themselves, or they might want it really, really, really bad, but they don't have the capacity or the capability to actually deliver like I could on it. And so then I'm bringing them on board based on a hope and a prayer, and they don't catch up. And then I'm overdoing the work, whether it's for my organization or for clients or in organizations that I was in before when I was having big teams responsible to me. And it sucked. It sucked because I would feel trapped, and then I began to feel bitter. And then when I'd be ready to hold people accountable, they'd feel really, really betrayed by me. And I had no problem giving the feedback, but I had multiple occasions where employees would say, if I have to work for her, I don't want to work on this team anymore. And in one situation in particular, my leader came to me and said, then you can't lead. Now, here's what happened. I hired a woman who had been in entry-level roles for a really long time. She was super bright and very artistic and introverted, kind of kept to herself. And I saw a ton of potential in her. She was very detail-oriented, took things very seriously, was very reliable in her work. And so I was like, you know what? I don't know why no one's ever given her the opportunity to truly own something, like take ownership instead of always being kind of an entry-level worker bee. And so I talked to her about it. She had the desire and I gave it to her. And it showed up pretty quickly that she would second guess herself and wasn't very confident. So I was like, this is no problem. I have enough confidence for both of us. So I was just coaching her and giving her the feedback. And then I created milestones and performance metrics and would check in with her. And you know what? Just like most people, she didn't like the accountability. She didn't like the accountability at all. And so I told her, hey, you've been doing this for about 6 months. And at this point, if I don't see you step into this area, I need you to step into this direction. And if you can't step into this direction, I might have to pivot this onto another person. And I'm not saying I'm going to terminate you, but we're going to have to look at, other responsibilities that you would need to do. She started targeting me. And there was an intern that I had that was super sweet, but kind of in and out and not really holding down the fort as a paid internship, not really delivering on what it is that she was supposed to deliver on. And this other woman was kind of like mother henning this intern, even though the intern was mine. And so I share with the intern, like, hey, you need to step up. I know you're in and out with your schooling, but here's what this position requires. And so there are other internships in the organization if this one's not a good fit for you, but based off of what you're telling me you want to learn and the accountability that you want to have, this is a good fit for you, but you need to deliver. Well, that intern felt like she'd gotten in trouble, shared that with this other woman, and this other woman went and stirred the pot. Nobody can work for Kerri. Well, the reality of it was I was holding people accountable. And I was setting clear expectations and then I was holding them accountable, but they didn't like the way that it felt. And part of it was there were times when I would hold them accountable, they wouldn't deliver. The work would still get done, right? Because who would do it? It was me. When I would remove boundaries, so I would tell them what they weren't accomplishing, but then instead of holding them accountable or disciplining them or firing them, I would still make sure the work would get done. I would be over responsible. And then the organization was being underdeveloped. And then when I would get to the point where I would be like, okay, this is 90 days pattern, we're going to do something about it. Then everyone's frustrated because it's like the first time I've ever said that I'm upset or disappointed or we're not meeting expectations. That wasn't true. The problem was I was stepping in and saving. Henry Cloud's work shows that when boundaries are unclear, leaders end up carrying responsibility that actually belongs to the other managers or other employees. That's when leaders feel burnt out, they feel resentful, and they feel trapped in decision fatigue. The system doesn't mature because it never has to, because the leader carries it all. Leaders aren't tired because they care too much. They're tired because they're holding responsibility that isn't theirs. I've certainly had to learn the hard way from that. So let's talk about what looks like compassion in the moment, which becomes confusion over time. And that is this whole process. Confusion is expensive. Research consistently shows that role clarity and expectation clarity are directly tied to engagement, trust in leadership, and decision velocity, the speed in which we're able to make decisions. When boundaries are vague or inconsistently enforced, stress increases, not decreases. That's why so many leaders feel exhausted. It's because they're not managing people. They're managing the emotional fallout of avoided authority. And then, God forbid, they come around and they decide they are going to exert their authority. Now we've got hurt feelings because it's been too soft. So unclear boundaries don't make you humane. They make you unpredictable. And that's not where we want to be when we're in the leadership seat. Let's tie this into trust, authority, and integrity, all things that we want to have. Trust isn't built by making accommodations. It's just not. Brené Brown's research reframes trust not as warmth or accessibility, but as reliability and integrity under pressure. She's explicit about this. She says clear is kind and unclear is unkind. And what's often missed at the leadership level is that unclear boundaries feel like emotional generosity in the moment, but they register as betrayal over time, like I mentioned. When you're overcompensating and then you have to step in and say, oh, but you haven't been delivering, it feels like a betrayal. Brené's research on trust shows that people experience trust when leaders are clear, when they are consistent, when they are accountable, not when they are endlessly flexible. When leaders blur boundaries to avoid discomfort, teams don't feel cared for. They actually feel misled. So we think we're being caring. We're actually misleading them because we're not being consistent or reliable. And from a trust perspective, clarity isn't just kind, it's actually protective. Leaders don't lose trust by saying no. That's not how we lose trust. We actually lose trust by saying yes and then resenting it, or by saying yes and then reversing it, or by enforcing it only selectively across our team. Trust is built when people understand what matters here at our organization, what doesn't matter here at our organization, what's not moving the needle, and what won't change depending on who's uncomfortable. From a relational standpoint, boundaries are how adults stay in relationship without resentment. And I can say I was upside down in a couple of my personal relationships, some very intimate personal relationships with my family. And when I started setting boundaries, the first reaction was, what is wrong with Kerri? We need to talk to her. Oh my goodness, do we need to have a family meeting? And my response was, we sure can. We sure can have a meeting about it, but I'm ready to say some things. I'm ready to be honest about the way that I feel. I'm ready to be honest about the way the situation's going, how it's negatively impacted me, and what I'm not willing to do any longer. And you know that we did not have a family meeting about that because in the past, it would have went very differently. But in the current, when I've learned to kind of stand up a little bit and stop resenting things and being honest and saying like, that doesn't work for me. That's how we can stay in a relationship, and things are actually getting better. We still have tension in the relationship. I don't think that will go away because I'm not going to act or perform the way anybody else wants me to act or perform, but things are getting better because they're clear. They're clear, and I'm being responsible to my own feelings. From a leadership standpoint, boundaries are how organizations truly scale without chaos. So let's take a look at this from a faith perspective. Scripture reinforces this idea over and over again. One of the verses is, let your yes be yes and your no be no. And this isn't harsh. That's integrity. Clarity is not cruelty. It's alignment. And so throughout Scripture, authority is paired with stewardship. Authority is not paired with popularity because using your authority doesn't make you popular a lot of times, but boundaries are a form of stewardship. Authority is always paired with limits in the Bible. I talk about finitude on this podcast a lot and how that's a gift that we've been given because we need rest, because we can't do it all, because we're not God. Our finitude is actually a gift to us. Instead of us being expected to overextend, we actually need to sleep in a day. We actually need to take brain breaks. There are things that we have to do to take good care of ourselves, or we'll get sick, ill, die, whatever. So authority is always paired with limits. Even Jesus withdrew, right? He said no. He disappointed people. He went off on his own without explaining himself endlessly. And that gives me a lot of hope. Scripture doesn't model boundarylessness leadership. It actually models discerned availability. Withdraw is not avoidance in the Bible. It's stewardship. But goodness, Jesus sure did withdraw a lot and encouraged his disciples to do so too. So authority does not equal availability. Clarity does not equal cruelty, and boundaries are not a lack of love. Authority doesn't erode trust, but inconsistent authority does erode trust. So let's apply this as parents just a little bit. I know I've got a lot of parents that listen to the show. Parenting exposes this tension faster than leadership ever will, in my opinion, because children don't feel secure when rules change based on mood or pushback. They feel secure when boundaries are clear. They feel secure when boundaries are consistent, and they feel secure when those boundaries are held with presence. And the same is true for teams. Consistency communicates safety. And this has been a big push that I've seen. I want to say it's a trend a little bit that I've seen in the HR world, is making sure that we've got safe work environments, and consistency communicates safety. Inconsistency creates anxiety, even when it's labeled as kindness. Henry Cloud often uses parenting to show that limits are what allow people to grow. Children don't experience limits as rejection. They experience them as structure, and the same is true for teams. Cloud talks about how limits actually create freedom because people know where they stand. And in parenting, similarly, when boundaries are inconsistent, kids push harder, not less. So if your kid is constantly pushing up against you, that's because you're shifting your boundaries, and they can see that. Gosh, I did that crap all the time as a kid because I could see the different angles that I could work, and I would work them. In organizations, it's the exact same. Unclear boundaries invite constant testing from your employees. Teams don't push because they're trying to be difficult. They push because the system is unclear and they're trying to figure out where they stop and start. At the executive level, the work isn't learning to set boundaries. It's deciding which boundaries you're willing to be misunderstood for. That's huge. We say to our son all the time, he's 14, and we say, it's lonely at the top. And we say that because if you want to be set apart and you want to be different, that means sometimes you have to be misunderstood and you have to be isolated or isolating. And it's the same thing when it comes with boundaries. You have to decide which boundaries you're willing to be misunderstood for. It's recognizing that being clear may disappoint people, may not feel great in the moment. That holding the line may cause some tension, and explaining the why doesn't mean negotiating the outcome. This is where advisory support matters. So in leadership positions, we are alone a lot. We should not be talking to our employees about the struggles that we have as a leader. That, if you've ever heard, crap's not supposed to flow downhill, right? And that's not the exact same, but it's something similar. And so if you're in a leadership position, if you are a small business owner or an entrepreneur and you're alone, you need to get some advisory support. You need to get a coach, or you need to get somebody like me who can come alongside you, because that support matters. Leaders don't struggle with policies. Most of the time, they struggle with self-trust under pressure. This is the work I do in my fractional CHRO engagements. It's not about writing rules, but strengthening the authority behind them. It's also the work that I do in executive rooms, board conversations, and leadership retreats where boundaries aren't theoretical, they're actually lived. So here's the question I want to leave you with. Where have you mistaken responsibility for harshness, and you have paid with it for confusion instead? If you're a leader who knows clarity is the issue and that it's not compliance being the issue, this is the work that we can do together. I support organizations through fractional CHRO partnerships, through executive advisory, through speaking engagements with leadership teams and boards. I also host leadership retreats and HR retreats focused on authority, trust, and decision-making under pressure. So if you want more information about any of those, you're welcome to go to saltandlightadvisors.com, or you can shoot us an email at hi@saltandlightadvisors.com. And if this episode resonated, subscribe to it. I'd love it if you'd subscribe to my show, share it with another leader who needs to hear it, and continue the conversation. I know that boundaries can feel like chaos. We're not really sure where to draw them and where not to, but boundaries aren't harsh. They're responsible, and responsible leadership is what organizations and leaders are truly starving for. And your employees are starving for it too. I guarantee you, even if that's not what they're articulating, they want clarity and consistency and clear boundaries. So don't waste the chaos. Embrace it. Until next time.